Hello, Baylor College of Medicine class of 2024. How exciting is that? My name is Benjamin. I am an MS2, and I am also a PRN mentor for PRN group number 1, the Acton Rockets. Shout out to them. And I have the opportunity to discuss mindfulness with you all today as part of your transitions curriculum. To let you know what kind of we're going to be talking about, I get ahead of myself. We're going to do an activity just to let you all know how crazy I am. And you saw on the last slide, it does involve raisins. But then we're also going to dive into the definition of mindfulness and really making sure that we all are on the same page whenever we say the word mindfulness, the history of mindfulness and its current applications today. And then we're also going to talk about how to create a daily practice for yourself so that hopefully this is a tool that you can take with you on this first year, this first semester of medical school, to help your own mental well-being and your own mental health. But again, I am crazy, as my PRN probably already knows and has realized by now. So we're going to start off with a great activity that's a great illustration of mindfulness in action. And so hopefully, I'm not sure how this is going to all work, but your mentors might have little boxes of raisin, or everybody has access to a raisin at this point. And so go ahead and grab your raisin real fast. We'll get this out of the way because I know you're dying, you're probably starving, and so you got to eat a raisin. It's going to be really helpful if you're starving. But we're going to start off just by noticing how much sensory detail we can get out of a single raisin when we are really paying attention to the present moment. And I hope you'll be surprised by how much sheer sensation is involved in such a tiny thing and in the consumption of such a tiny thing when we really take time to attend to the process. I know this sounds ridiculous. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to roll your eyes with your PRN. Totally cool. I am crazy, but it's a good illustration and it's kind of fun. So start off just by holding your raisin and just looking at it. We're going to start just by admiring and noticing the details of our raisin. Roll it over a couple times and start with the question in your group. And there should be a little question that pops up if all the technology works correctly. Or if you have to watch this video straight on YouTube and I keep saying that questions are popping up, go ahead and just pause the video and answer the question as a small group. But you're noticing your raisin, and what color is your raisin? If you had to put this color into words and you can't put raisin colored, what color is this? I suspect a lot of people would put dark purple. But if I were to Google an image of dark purple, do you really think we would get the color of a raisin is my question, right? Probably not. So dark purple may not be great, like dark purplish brown. Maybe some of the really creative people might have typed in. Who knows? It's okay, it's really hard to describe, but we're just paying attention to the color. And also notice how it may catch a reflection in the light. Maybe you have a pretty matte raisin, or maybe you have a shiny one. And some areas of your raisin might be thinner than others whenever you have a little ridge. And you can kind of see a lighter color through that with the light coming through. It's a little translucent versus darkness. And as you've been rolling your raisin around, you've also been feeling it on your fingertips. And you can feel kind of if you have maybe a little bit of a juicier raisin, or some people might have drier raisins, but you can kind of pick that up just by giving your raisin a very slight, gentle squeeze. And you can also feel the shape of your raisin. Some might be flatter, some might be rounder, noticing if yours is any particular shape or not that you could describe. And then after you have gleaned as much information as you can from looking at and feeling your raisin, we're actually going to hold it up to our nose and we're just going to see if we can smell the raisin. Go ahead, it's not weird. Everybody else is doing it too. And you're like, that smells probably what a raisin is going to taste like. That rings as true. Go ahead, clear your nose. Make sure you get a nice fresh waft of raisin again. Nice. And then the next thing we're going to do is we are going to put the raisin in our mouth, but we are not going to chew the raisin. We're going to let it rest on our tongue. And I invite you to close your eyes just to really pick up as much raisin flavor as you can. You don't have to close your eyes if that's weird for you. That's cool. Tastes like a raisin. Still haven't chewed it yet. Don't chew it. But you can also pick up more of the tactile sensation of the raisin between your tongue and the roof of your mouth. Feel the wrinkles. Roll it over a couple times. Can you feel the same shape of the raisin on your tongue that you felt when it was in between your fingers? And whenever you're ready, go ahead and put it on 1 molar, pick a side, and give it one chomp, just one. You gotta control yourself. How much flavor did you get out of just a single raisin chomp? That's my question. Quite a bit. If you roll it back to the front of your tongue, I can taste more of it now that it's cut. Hmm. And then you can also feel with the tip of your tongue the squishy part of the raisin inside instead of just the rough skin. And then take it back over to your molar and give it like 3, 4, 5 chomps. Hmm. And sit with the flavor. Go ahead and finish your raisin. Um, and as you do that, for some people who don't like raisins, that might have been kind of a negative experience, right? Um, Mindfulness does come from a Buddhist philosophy, and the Buddhists do say that it is not necessarily um, anything negative or positive in our lives that creates suffering, but it is always our reaction to them. So we'll dive into that and the kind of the philosophy behind that a little bit more. But if you don't like raisins, that was an excellent exercise to understand how your negative reaction to something probably created more suffering in your emotional and internal experience than just the raisin did to you. Because I gave you one raisin. And if you love raisins, you might have had a very positive reaction to that. But as we'll explore later, labeling things as positive or negative is not always a great idea. And it is not something that we do whenever we are practicing mindfulness, even though it's a very natural tendency that we do to everything in our life, is labeling something as good or bad. So we'll move on. Again, the definition, history, applications, and how to create your own daily practice. And I like starting off with this little cartoon. Go ahead and read it. As a reminder to go ahead and turn off your devices. You might have just heard probably, I just received an email. I thought I had muted my notifications. I apologize. But I love this cartoon because this is like all anybody knows about mindfulness. We throw out the word a ton, and then we have all these other buzzwords that surround it, such as live in the moment, got to practice being mindful, and I'm supposed to be present in the moment. And that's probably, for most people, the extent of the knowledge. It's like, I'm supposed to do these things, but we don't really dive into how. We don't necessarily dive into why. And we don't necessarily understand the nuance and details that goes beyond just the buzzwords presented in this cartoon. So diving into that, we need to acknowledge that mindfulness should be defined the same way every time. And this is important because whenever we are looking at the research and literature on mindfulness, I have read many, many articles on mindfulness that are not actually measuring mindfulness. We do not use the same definition of mindfulness. If we are not precise with what we mean, it's impossible to measure. And so the literature it's hard to draw meaningful conclusions. We don't actually necessarily know the extent of the benefits of mindfulness yet because we have conflated the term over and over and over again, especially, I'll dive into this more later, but especially as we apply it to K through 12 schools and public curricula and things like this. So what is the definition of mindfulness is that there are two components that you could probably guess as your attentional component, and then there's also an attitudinal component. And there are 3 qualifications to those 2 components, or there are 3 subcomponents underneath those larger categories. Most people are familiar with this. It was in the cartoon. Part of being mindful and practicing mindfulness is to pay attention to the present moment. Very traditional mindfulness practices will have people use their breath as a tool in order to pay attention to the present moment. But we also need to understand that present moment has some variability in and of itself, just that term and that language. So I chose this picture of the coffee cup very specifically because you can see the drops flying through the air. And you might think this picture was captured in a single moment of time. However, if you notice that some of the drops at the top with a little bit faster velocity are a little bit blurry. And so the photographer didn't have quite enough, short enough shutter speed to actually capture a single moment. But the question then is, and without diving into too much of physics and time and everything, is there are an infinite number of moments within the present moment. Just sure, go ahead and be mind boggled. I certainly was the first time I had read that. But again, so it's about making sure that we are not trying to record or remember our mindfulness experience as it happens, nor are we trying to do any sort of self-analyzation. It is simply letting our awareness absorb any of the details of the present moment as they are occurring live. Otherwise, if you get hung up on something, you are no longer paying attention to the present moment, regardless if that is 1 full second or 1/100th of a second in the case of this camera. And the next component then, and this is the one that's usually missed in people's understanding of mindfulness, is that it is purposefully paying attention to the present moment. And again, this graphic with the guy watching Netflix was very intentionally selected because if we didn't have this component of mindfulness, I could be watching TV and I would be mindful. We'll look at the last component of mindfulness in a second. But paying attention to the present moment and then doing so with a non-judgmental attitude, I could be doing when I'm watching TV. But the act and practice of mindfulness is very effortful, requires a lot of self-directed will of attention, that prefrontal cortex control. The best metaphor or analogy for practicing mindfulness that I've come across yet is like doing bicep curls, in all honesty. And I don't go to the gym, so this analogy applies to everybody because this is not difficult to understand, I promise. But the analogy is that every time you fail to pay attention to the present moment and you return your mind to that present moment awareness with an attitude of non-judgment, it's doing a curl. You are strengthening your own ability to direct your attention and your awareness in very specific ways. The goal of mindfulness is, in fact, not to always keep your attention on the present moment. The practice is in pulling your attention and your awareness back to that present moment with the attitude of non-judgment over and over and over again. And you can also exercise by holding something heavy out in front of you and seeing how hard it is to maintain that, right? So if you've gotten past kind of like the curl stage of learning how to be mindful and practice a mindfulness meditation, and then you can maintain your awareness on the present moment, it gets harder for longer and longer periods of time. And that is kind of the exercise in and of itself. It is an exercise. It is an exercise and a tool for us to be able to kind of understand our own psyches and our own thought processes better. And the last part here is the attitude of non-judgment. So the label was specifically chosen as well because we label everything habitually, unconsciously. We label everything in our present present day, moment-to-moment experience as either positive or negative. And a lot of times we don't realize necessarily that we're doing it. But it is that labeling and the instinctual reaction that we have to events in our life that can lead to many other negative things, right? So the goal of mindfulness is to try and surrender those labels, to be aware of whatever is happening in our lives in that present moment, to be aware of our breath, to be aware of our posture, wherever your attention is again an exercise of surrendering those labels actively. Many times, even as you notice that you have labeled something, it is reframing your thought process of whatever you encountered in that present moment. So we ate a raisin, and to tie around that theme in this presentation, imagine incorporating a mindfulness practice for yourself that is just eating breakfast mindfully. We were able to get a whole 7 minutes out of a single raisin when we really took the time to notice every detail of the raisin and our experience eating it, right? Imagine a bowl of cereal. If you really took the time to sit with in that present moment and not allowing your mind to go off on planning everything else you have to do in that day and everything else. Imagine the sheer amount of sensation and things to be discovered within eating a bowl of cereal. It's kind of mind-blowing. It's probably an impossible task to really to really do that mindfully and understand every detail of the experience. But it's a very easy way to incorporate mindfulness kind of into your daily life and practice. The other thing I want to mention on this slide, and I talked kind of about prefrontal cortex control earlier, whenever we're pulling our attention back to the present moment. Through fMRI studies, they have found what they have described in the literature as a default mode network. So certain areas, and fMRI studies have their own limitations, et cetera, and so forth, but there have been kind of enough consensus of people studying this to put together this theory or this framework for why mindfulness is effective. And it is that we are interrupting this default mode network. They say that certain parts of the brain are activated habitually and instinctually that allow us to plan for the future and reminisce and learn from the past. And not just plan for the future, but worry about the future and ruminate instead of just reminisce on the past. These are inherently negative sometimes, and it helps, it was evolutionary, is kind of the theory behind why mindfulness works in a neurocognitive way. Is that mindfulness allows us to interrupt that default mode network. Then we get into a habit whenever our brain is still of starting to plan or worry, or we start thinking about the past. And if we can interrupt that habitual process, we're better able to direct our attention in more meaningful and helpful ways for our own life. So mindfulness was originally a Buddhist concept, and you'll find that people who understand mindfulness really acknowledge this fact, at least in a sentence in every paper that they publish or something like this, because we want to make sure that we are respecting its cultural background whenever we are talking about this. I cannot pronounce mindfulness as you see it on the screen correctly. It's somewhere along the lines of samasati. I do not speak Sanskrit. I do not know how to pronounce it. But it is the seventh element of the Eight Noble Path in Buddhism. I can tell you that, with the last step being correct meditation or correct awareness. So mindfulness allows us to get into a headspace, and it is used as a tool both nowadays and in Buddhist practice. It creates the foundation you need in order to do something like practice compassion or do a gratitude practice. But it's always step one whenever it's being practiced both as a therapeutic technique and as a religious practice. It allows for someone to cultivate more compassion around a certain topic, or to reanalyze and kind of reframe whatever else might be going on in their life. And it was first introduced as a Western scientific field by Jon Kabat-Zinn. He used it specifically as a therapy for chronic pain patients. So on whatever valid scale that he was using for people to self-report their subjective measures of pain, he found that on average, pain reports decreased by 50% at the beginning to the end of his practice. And I believe his therapy was 6 to 8 weeks, either weekly or bi-weekly, of a mindfulness practice that he himself put together. And you got to be careful with placebo effects and whatnot. Placebo effects generally leave after a follow-up, and we see kind of a return to normal. But after a 6-month follow-up of his chronic pain patients, they had developed some new skill because they still had that 50% decrease in their self-reported pain. The other scale he used was a scale that was measuring the how that pain affected quality of life. Again, kind of a self-report standardized scale, and that was also decreased on an average of 50%. And that was originally published in 1982, but he really is credited with being the founder of mindfulness in the sense of bringing it over from Buddhism and establishing it in Western scientific peer-reviewed journals. So his book is on the left, Jon Kabat-Zinn's Wherever You Go, There You Are. It's a fantastic book. It was actually my first introduction into mindfulness, and it is not a step-by-step guide, even though it kind of serves that role and that purpose of how to incorporate mindfulness meditation into your own life. He goes into detail about posture and breathing and why and thought processes, and I'm going to touch a little bit on that later. But it's an incredibly well-written and excellent resource. And the one on the right I actually wanted to mention, because I said that mindfulness is the first step in order to allow us to practice compassion or self-compassion or gratitude. And Kristen Neff is actually a researcher who I took a class with at UT Austin. Hook 'em horns for everybody in your class who also came from UT. fabulous, fabulous researcher, and she kind of defined self-compassion in the literature. And part of her definition of self-compassion rightfully included mindfulness as the first component. And then she said, we're able to recognize our common humanity, and that suffering is a part of humanity, etc. But if you're interested in kind of learning a little bit more about related topics, I would definitely recommend this resource, Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff. But again, Jon Kabat-Zinn introduced mindfulness into the literature in 1982, and we, since then, have seen an explosion of research that's going on in this field with many, many different applications of mindfulness. But again, a lot of that has been criticized because we are not maintaining the original definition of mindfulness that we went over at the very beginning. And how we measure it has changed as well too. Jon Kabat-Zinn and others have themselves published scales for self-report questionnaires on mindfulness and mindfulness activities, which are the premier gold standard. But we also know that it's been popularized by Oprah and others, and we see it in classes for Google employees. And so it really has taken off as a field. Some of the applications now of mindfulness include mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBCT and MBSR, respectively. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is more focused, like cognitive behavioral therapy, on identifying particular thoughts, first identifying them, making sure we're not labeling them as positive or negative, and then it goes into more of the CBT side of reframing and restructuring how we relate to and associate ourselves with those thoughts. And CBT is, more about defining them as logical and whatnot. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is used more for anxiety, PTSD, and is more of a general approach to emotions instead of specific thoughts. Mindfulness in curricula, I mentioned this briefly earlier, has been conflated strongly, or has been conflated a lot, with social emotional learning programs in schools, SEL programs. And a lot of third-party companies are selling mindfulness curricula to public school districts that are not adhering to that definition of mindfulness that we went over earlier. Again, paying attention to the present moment, doing so purposefully and effortfully, and then also having an attitude of non-judgment. And instead, they're doing things like write about a time you were upset with your brother, and what words did you use, and how did your actions affect someone else's emotions, which would fall wonderfully into an emotional EQ sort of curricula, but is not adhere to that mindfulness that we see. So lots of confusion around what is mindfulness, and hopefully you're getting a little bit more understanding of making sure that we adhere to that definition, and it's taking in things from the present moment and making sure that we aren't labeling them as good or bad. So moving on to how do you incorporate a mindfulness practice into your own life, if this is something that you want to try. I've pointed to how to learn more as well with Jon Kabat-Zinn's book, but I would encourage people to sit down and give it a go before they even read the book. Continuity, like with all habit forming practices, it is best to do it at the same time, in the same way. I would encourage you to face the same direction and sit in the same place. And that way you come to expect that sort of consistency. And this is probably the number one reason why people have always said, yeah, I've dabbled in some meditation and some mindfulness before, and then I really didn't feel like I was doing it correctly, so I stopped. I know there are people watching this video right now who have said those exact same words in their own mind or to someone else before. And the key takeaway here is, again, with the bicep curls and with the exercise, mindfulness is not about doing it correctly. You can't do it wrong, right? Because each time you recognize that your thoughts got distracted on something else and you bring your attention back to the present moment, you've done it correctly. So if you think that you're doing it wrong, you're only aware of that because you were able to recognize that your thoughts left and you did another bicep curl. It's an exercise. It is a practice. It is not a skill to try and just have or master, or that you're going to get even doing it twice. How long did it take to learn to ride a bicycle? Okay. Keep a journal. I strongly recommend this. I've been asked before, if I keep a journal, what am I writing in it after a mindfulness exercise? If it's truly just a mindfulness exercise, people recommend that you just write down a reflection. If anything came up for you, go ahead and note that. You might be able to track themes and kind of what you are able to find in your own mind after you're able to sit down and be calm for a while. And then go ahead and if you need to label your own mindfulness experience as positive or negative, this is getting easier for me, or I find my mind is wandering less. Things like this are good to note so you can see change over time. If you want to go ahead and take the next step and you want to dive into mindfulness plus compassion, mindfulness plus self-compassion, mindfulness plus gratitude, it's very easy to reflect then on the emotions that you experience from the second component of that practice or that meditation. And then tell your friends, maybe this is something that your little PRN group could try and do together and keep each other accountable for on a week-to-week basis as you go along throughout your first semester. I'm not saying I'm forcing that on my own PRN. Sorry, y'all, don't get all scared. But if you want to try that, I'm sure your PRN mentors would be supportive as well. So, build a community and answer other people's questions about mindfulness now that you even understand what we've discussed here today. So again, practice the same way every day. Don't punish yourself, don't punish yourself, don't punish yourself. You can't do it wrong. If you sat down and you breathed and you paid attention to your present moment, or if you paid attention to the present moment while eating a bowl of cereal, good on you. I'm gonna pat you on the back. You want a hug, you want a high five, just come let me know. Keep a journal. You can probably see some changes over time, and then tell your friends and build a community. I love this phrase. I did not come up with this. It was actually, I think, coined by John Kabat-Zinn or another researcher, a big wig in the field. Don't just do something, sit there. How often do we have a couple spare minutes and the first thing we do is we pull out our phone and we get on Instagram? I'm guilty, totally guilty. Although I've resorted a little bit more to Twitter in recent weeks and recent months, and Instagram as my kind of go-to default mode network, being able to worry about the world, I go through Twitter. Instead, I would encourage you to identify those times in your life and choose just to sit down, notice your present moment environment. If it feels weird to close your eyes, just notice the details in your world and the present moment and what you're experiencing, or close your eyes and take some deep breaths. And on that note, that's actually what I would encourage us to do and try here today. We're going to close our eyes and practice a little tiny meditation, a baby one. I promise I won't hurt you. If you've never done it before, you can't do it wrong. If you've done it a million times, join us and then reflect afterwards and bounce your experience and other people's experiences around so that you can kind of compare notes and see how it went. But before we get started, the very first thing I want you to do is I want you to just notice, without moving, I want you to notice how your body is positioned in the chair right now. So notice how you're sitting. And then specifically notice where you feel the chair touching your skin or clothes. Where is the weight directed? Is it evenly distributed? Is it pushing on one part of your body versus another? And as you have this awareness of where your body is right now, just take a few deep breaths. And then without labeling your posture as previously being good or bad, I would invite you to change it however you'd like so that you are comfortable, but also attentive. This may include making sure your feet are flat on the floor, making sure your bottom is at the very back of the chair, and making sure that you're sitting up straight. And maybe you're going to rest your hands on your knees or in your lap. And as we take one or two more deep breaths, you don't have to. You are invited to close your eyes or just cast your gaze downward and try not to look or focus on anything in your visual field. You're still taking those deep breaths. And wherever your attention went, go ahead and bring it to your breath now without changing how you're breathing. You may feel the breath in your belly, or you may feel it in the rise and fall of your chest. We aren't controlling our breath, we're just noticing it. And when you notice that your mind has wandered off, don't critique yourself. Just take note and gently bring your awareness back to the breath. And when you're ready, bring your attention back to the weight of your body in your seat. You can feel the chair supporting you. And take a deep breath in and out. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. You don't need to label that experience. I would invite you to not try and resist the effort to label it as interesting or weird or positive or negative. Instead, go ahead and take 1, 2, 3 minutes with your group leaders to just share what you noticed. Only those observations in a non judgmental way. Um, and then if there are any themes, I would invite you to go ahead and put those in the question box at the bottom as well. I look forward to reading them. Again, my name is Benjamin Solder. If you have any more questions, if I can be of any help over the next year of medical school, please reach out and let me know. It was a pleasure. Thanks, guys.